Let's begin with the first reality that most empaths overlook, and that is the silent economy of energy. Human relationships, whether we acknowledge it or not, operate on an exchange. Words, emotions, gestures, they all carry weight, and they all transfer something between people. For most healthy individuals, this exchange is balanced. You give some, you receive some. But for the empath, this balance is often shattered. They give endlessly patience, attention, emotional labor, forgiveness, compassion, and they assume this generosity is simply who they are. But what they rarely recognize is that all of this has a cost. The cost is their vitality. The cost is their life force. There are people who know how to sense this light. They don't come to you by accident. They gravitate toward the empath because they know, consciously or unconsciously, that here lies a well that does not run dry, or at least one that does not appear to. These people may not provide love or support in return. They may not even intend to, but they feed consistently on what you supply. It's not unlike a parasite in nature. It attaches itself to a host that has what it lacks, and it takes, slowly and relentlessly, until the host is weakened. This is the hidden economy of energy. The empath pays and the other collects. Now you might say, but isn't that what love is? Isn't love about giving? Of course, love involves sacrifice. Love requires attention and devotion, but love is never supposed to become a system of extraction where one person thrives and the other diminishes. That is not love. That is predation disguised as intimacy. When your presence in someone's life consistently leaves you depleted while leaving them empowered, you're not in a relationship, you're in a transaction. And it's a transaction where you are always on the losing side. The tragedy is that many empaths mistake this depletion for purpose. They believe, often at a very deep level, that their role in life is to carry burdens, to absorb pain, to be the one who heals. And so, even when they sense the imbalance, they justify it. They tell themselves it's noble, it's compassionate, it's spiritual. But there is nothing noble about handing over your soul until there is nothing left of you. There is nothing compassionate about enabling someone else's weakness while destroying your own strength. And here's where the psychological depth comes in. The empath does not realize that their willingness to give endlessly is not only a gift but also a vulnerability. It is the very trait that makes them indispensable, but it is also the very trait that makes them exploitable. Narcissists, manipulators, and energy vampires know this instinctively. They recognize that if they pull on the string of empathy long enough, the empath will unravel. So the first warning is simple but profound: your light is not infinite. It feels infinite because it flows so naturally from you, but it is not. And if you keep giving without recognizing that others are feeding on it without replenishment, you will eventually become a shell of yourself. That is the fate of many empaths who never awaken to this truth. The final thing to grasp is this: every interaction is an exchange, whether you acknowledge it or not. And the moment you realize this, you can begin to see who is depositing into you and who is withdrawing from you. That awareness alone can shift everything, because once you see the silent economy, you can no longer deny its effects. So remember this: if you do not place value on your own light, someone else will, and they will claim it as theirs. One of the deepest traps that empaths fall into is confusing their identity with their service to others. This is subtle because on the surface it seems virtuous: to care, to help, to heal. These are noble aims. And for the empath, these acts flow naturally. But when you look closer, you begin to see that the drive to constantly rescue others often hides a dangerous confusion: the belief that I am valuable only insofar as I am useful to someone else. That's not compassion. That's self-erasure masquerading as love. This is where the danger lies, because predators and narcissists are quick to exploit this psychological weakness. They know that if you equate your worth with how much you can give, then you will tolerate endless taking. You'll rationalize neglect, betrayal, even outright abuse. because you'll frame your suffering as sacrifice, and your sacrifice as proof of love. The more you give up, the more convinced you become that you're doing what you were meant to do. And in this way, the empath doesn't just lose their energy, they lose their very sense of self. There's a psychological principle here worth noting. Human beings are always striving for meaning, and one of the most powerful ways we experience meaning is by being needed. If someone needs you, you feel significant. If someone depends on you, you feel indispensable. But what happens when that need is endless, manipulative, and insatiable? What happens when the other person isn't really interested in healing, but only in keeping you bound to their chaos? Then your desire for meaning becomes a leash around your neck. You're not saving anyone. You're being used. The tragic irony is that many empaths feel most alive when they are pouring themselves into others, and least alive when they focus on themselves. They've been conditioned, often from childhood, to believe that attention to self is selfish, while attention to others is love. But this conditioning blinds them to an essential truth. If your identity rests solely on being the healer, then you need broken people to feel whole. That makes you vulnerable to predators, because your sense of purpose depends on their dysfunction. Think about that for a moment. If your worth is tied to fixing others, then you have a subconscious incentive to tolerate the brokenness around you. You won't demand reciprocity, you won't enforce boundaries, because deep down you're afraid that if they no longer need you, you'll have no identity left. That fear keeps you in relationships that drain you long after you should have walked away. And this is the point empaths must confront. True worth cannot come from endless service. It has to come from the recognition that you have intrinsic value, apart from what you give. If you don't anchor your identity in something deeper than your usefulness to others, you will forever be trapped in cycles of exploitation. So the warning here is clear. If you make being needed the foundation of who you are, you will always attract those who feed on need. And they will keep feeding, until you remember that your existence is not defined by the weight you carry for others. Your worth is not measured by how much of yourself you can burn away for someone else's comfort. One of the most insidious dynamics that empaths must come to terms with is the way manipulation disguises itself as need. On the surface, it looks like someone is vulnerable. They tell you their story of pain, their history of betrayal, their moments of despair. They appear wounded, fragile, in desperate need of understanding. And to the empath, this is like a magnet. You're drawn in because you believe that to help is to heal and to heal is to love. But here's the danger: not every expression of need is genuine. Sometimes it is a mask. Sometimes it is a carefully constructed lure designed to disarm you, to lower your defenses, and to keep you entangled in a role that benefits them at your expense. This is where the psychological cunning of narcissists and manipulators becomes evident. They've learned through experience that portraying themselves as victims is the fastest way to secure loyalty and devotion. If they can convince you that they are broken, that they cannot stand without your constant support, you will bind yourself to them. You'll overlook red flags, you'll excuse their cruelty, and you'll tell yourself they're only acting this way because they've been hurt. And in that moment, they've trapped you not through strength, but through the illusion of weakness. The empath, by nature, is predisposed to respond to suffering. But not every cry for help comes from a place of authenticity. Some are strategic, some are performative. And here's the bitter truth. The more you respond automatically to every display of need, the easier it is for someone to control you. Because once they realize that your empathy can be triggered like a switch, they can flip it at will. One tear, one confession, one plea for understanding, and you're hooked again. This cycle is devastating because it feels like intimacy. You believe that opening yourself up to their pain is what creates connection, but in reality it's a form of dependency, one that keeps you locked in place. You become the caretaker, the healer, the steady one, while they remain the perpetual victim. And if they remain the victim, they never have to change. They never have to take responsibility. They never have to grow. Why would they, when your compassion provides them with all the validation they need to stay exactly where they are? This is why empaths must learn to discern the difference between genuine need and manipulative need. Genuine need seeks healing and growth. It asks for help in order to rise. Manipulative need seeks only to maintain the imbalance. It asks for help in order to avoid responsibility. The first empowers both people. The second drains one and empowers the other. So, the question you must ask yourself is this: am I helping someone to stand on their own? Or am I enabling someone to keep me kneeling beside them? Because if it's the latter, you are not in a relationship built on love. You are caught in a performance designed to keep you feeding a hunger that will never be satisfied. And that's the warning. Not every plea for compassion is real. Some are traps. And the moment you see that clearly, you'll understand that protecting your empathy is not cruelty. It is wisdom. When an empath continues to give without restraint, when they allow their light to be siphoned without demanding reciprocity, the consequences are not abstract, they are devastatingly real. The body begins to feel the weight of it first. Exhaustion sets in, not the kind that a good night's sleep can fix, but the deep kind, the kind that seeps into your bones. It becomes harder to wake up in the morning, harder to focus, harder to feel joy in the ordinary. What most empaths don't realize is that chronic self-sacrifice rewires the nervous system itself. You become conditioned to hyper-attune to others, always scanning the room for someone's needs or moods, while neglecting your own state entirely. Over time, this constant outward focus leaves you drained of the capacity to simply exist as yourself. Psychologically, the toll is even sharper. Anxiety creeps in because you are always waiting for the next crisis you'll have to resolve, always anticipating the demands others will make on you. Depression follows because you begin to sense, even if dimly, that no matter how much you give, it is never enough. And that despair becomes heavier with time, because deep down you realize that the very people you pour yourself into are not becoming stronger, not becoming healthier, but are in fact feeding more greedily on your sacrifices. The empath begins to feel invisible, but it's not invisibility in the poetic sense. It's invisibility in the sense of being consumed until there is nothing of you left to be seen. The emotional cost is equally severe. A person who continually prioritizes others above themselves will inevitably lose touch with their own desires, their own preferences, even their own identity. Ask such a person, "What do you want?" And they often cannot answer. Years of self-denial erode the connection to the self so profoundly that the empath becomes a mirror for others, but a stranger to themselves. And when you lose yourself in that way, you are easy to control, because a person who has no clear sense of self cannot defend it. And then there's the spiritual dimension, which is often overlooked but may be the most important. When you give away your light indiscriminately, you begin to dim, not just emotionally or physically, but existentially. You feel cut off from meaning, from purpose, from that inner sense that your life is moving towards something worthwhile. You become hollow, and hollowness is exactly the state in which predators thrive, because it ensures you'll cling to them even harder, hoping to fill the void they themselves created. This is the cruel irony. What begins as selfless compassion ends as self-destruction, and the more the empath sacrifices, the less capable they are of truly helping anyone. Because you cannot lift others when you are crushed under your own exhaustion. You cannot heal when you are broken down. You cannot shine when your light has been extinguished. So the truth is stark but necessary. Unchecked sacrifice is not a virtue, it is a slow suicide. And the sooner you recognize this, the sooner you can choose to live differently, because your life is not meant to be burned down to keep others warm. There comes a point, if an empath is honest enough with themselves, when the fog begins to lift. It often doesn't happen all at once. It arrives in fragments, in small moments that gnaw at the mind. You notice that after every conversation, every encounter, you are left tired, drained, diminished, while the other seems somehow energized, lighter, even triumphant. At first, you dismiss it. You tell yourself you're imagining things, or that this is simply the cost of loving deeply. But eventually, the pattern becomes undeniable, and that is when awakening begins. The realization that this has never been a relationship of mutual care, but a cycle of feeding, one in which you have been the perpetual source. This awakening is both liberating and terrifying. It's liberating because the truth always is. It clarifies, it exposes, it strips away the illusions that have bound you. But it's terrifying because it demands that you see people, perhaps people you've loved most deeply, for who they truly are. And that sight is often unbearable. To recognize that the intimacy you thought was real was, in fact, a performance meant to secure your devotion. That's not just painful, it's shattering. Many empaths hesitate here, because to admit the truth would mean rewriting their entire story of love and loyalty. Yet that hesitation prolongs the suffering. At the core of this awakening lies a principle that's difficult but essential to grasp. Love without boundaries is not love. It's surrender, it's submission to exploitation. When you give endlessly without demand for reciprocity, you're not loving the other person. You're enabling their weakness, and at the same time, you're betraying yourself. That is not compassion. That is complicity in your own diminishment. The psychological shift here is profound. You begin to see that what you thought was your highest virtue, your ability to pour yourself endlessly into others, has also been your greatest vulnerability. You recognize the parasitic structure. The more you give, the more is demanded. The less you resist, the less you exist. And suddenly, the pattern comes into focus. It was never about mutual connection. It was always about control. Now, what follows this realization is often grief. Grief for the time lost. Grief for the years spent carrying others while neglecting yourself. But within that grief is also the seed of freedom. Because once you see the truth, you cannot unsee it. And once you know that what you called love was actually exploitation, you have a choice: to continue the cycle knowingly, or to break it and reclaim yourself. And here lies the crucial turning point. Awakening is not simply about recognizing the pattern. It is about acting on it. It is about declaring with your life that you will no longer consent to being consumed. And that declaration changes everything, because it restores the one thing empaths so often forget they possess: sovereignty over their own light. So the warning here is sharp. If you refuse to awaken, you will remain food for others. But if you dare to see the truth, you will reclaim the power that was yours all along. And that power begins with one choice: to stop confusing exploitation with love. The most decisive moment in an empath's journey is the moment they choose withdrawal. Not withdrawal in the sense of abandoning humanity or rejecting love, but withdrawal from the parasitic cycle that has kept them enslaved. For too long, empaths believe that if they just love harder, give more, forgive longer, the dynamic will change. But it never does, because the problem isn't the quantity of your giving. It's the structure of the relationship itself. The only way to reclaim your light is to stop feeding those who see it only as fuel for their own survival. This is not easy because it feels unnatural to the empath. Saying no feels cold. Pulling back feels selfish. Setting boundaries feels cruel. But this is a distortion, a conditioning that has been drilled into them through years of equating sacrifice with virtue. The truth is far different. Without boundaries, love is impossible. Because love without limits dissolves into exploitation, and exploitation is the death of both connection and respect. When you learn to withdraw your energy from those who consume it without gratitude or growth, you're not withholding love, you're protecting it. And what happens when you do this is extraordinary. At first, the parasites rage. They panic, they guilt trip, they accuse you of betrayal. This is predictable because you've disrupted their supply, but if you stand firm, something shifts. You begin to feel your own strength returning. The fog lifts, the exhaustion fades, and your vitality begins to flow back into you. You realize that the energy you thought was gone forever was never lost. It was simply misplaced, constantly directed outward, never inward. The act of withdrawal reveals this hidden truth. Your light regenerates when it is respected, and it withers when it is consumed. Psychologically, this is a radical transformation. You move from dependency to autonomy. You no longer need to be needed. You no longer define yourself by the burdens you carry. Instead, you begin to build an identity rooted in sovereignty, in the recognition that your existence has value apart from what you give. Spiritually, the transformation is even greater. Your light is no longer a commodity, no longer something traded in a silent economy of exploitation. It becomes radiant, self-sustaining, untouchable, and that kind of light cannot be fed upon because it no longer leaks through broken boundaries. This reclamation is not an act of bitterness. It's not revenge. It's not even rejection. It is alignment with truth. To say no to those who would consume you is, in fact, to say yes to life, your growth, your purpose. And paradoxically, it's only from that position of strength that you can actually give freely. Because giving, when it comes from sovereignty, is no longer depletion, it's overflow. So here is the final warning. If you do not learn to withdraw from those who feed on you, they will take everything. But if you dare to step back, to reclaim what is yours, your light will no longer be consumable. It will be untouchable. And that is the kind of light the world truly needs.